Yes, she has, and we're only going to show you a tiny fraction of it. Make an effort to go and listen to it all. Of course, anything that Meghan does gets criticised, even though I think most people would say the intentions are good. Certainly the cause is good.
For years, Meghan Markle carefully built a public image that millions accepted as truth. But now, critics claim Prince William has done something unexpected. Without public attacks, dramatic interviews, or direct accusations, they believe he has allowed documents, past statements, and mounting contradictions to tell a very different story. As old claims face renewed scrutiny and public debate intensifies, questions are growing louder than ever. Is this the moment Meghan's carefully crafted narrative finally begins to fall apart? So, what do you think? Has public perception turned against Meghan? Share your thoughts below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more royal news. When old records speak loudly. For years, the debate surrounding Meghan seemed driven by headlines, speculation, and competing interpretations. Then something unusual began happening. Attention started shifting away from anonymous palace sources and toward documents that had been available in public view all along. Archived agreements, recorded interviews, official statements, and previously overlooked details suddenly became the focus of intense discussion. Online communities revisited material that many people had forgotten. Commentators compared past claims with more recent actions. The conversation changed from what insiders were supposedly saying to what could actually be verified. That shift created a very different kind of controversy for many observers. At the center of the growing scrutiny was Prince William, though not because of any dramatic public intervention. What stood out was his silence. There were no lengthy interviews, no direct accusations, and no visible campaign against Meghan. Yet royal watchers increasingly argued that he no longer needed one. The material attracting attention was already available for anyone willing to examine it. Every resurfaced document encouraged fresh questions. Every archived statement invited comparison. Supporters and critics reached different conclusions, but both sides found themselves looking at the same records. That unusual dynamic only intensified public interest in recent months alone. As discussions expanded, older agreements returned to the spotlight. Records connected to earlier decisions were shared across social media, dissected in videos, and debated in comment sections. Some observers believed these documents revealed contradictions that had gone unnoticed for years. Others insisted the same material was being interpreted unfairly or without proper context. That disagreement became part of the story itself. Instead of settling questions, the renewed attention created even more of them. Why were these records attracting interest now? What had changed in public perception? And why did familiar events suddenly appear significant again to so many people everywhere? The deeper people looked, the more the mystery seemed to grow. Interviews, once viewed as routine, were re-examined beside later remarks. Public actions were measured against earlier commitments. Small details that previously attracted little attention became subjects of extensive analysis. None of this produced universal agreement. In fact, the opposite often occurred. The same evidence fueled entirely different interpretations depending on who was examining it. Still, the volume of discussion continued rising. The debate was no longer centered on rumors. It was increasingly centered on a paper trail that many believed deserved closer scrutiny before broader conclusions were reached publicly. By this stage, the central conflict had become impossible to ignore. Meghan remained the subject of intense examination, while William remained largely in the background. Yet his absence from the public argument appeared to strengthen the perception that events were unfolding without his involvement. To some observers, that made the emerging questions seem more powerful. To others, it demonstrated how easily old information could be repackaged into a new narrative. Either way, attention kept returning to the same documents, the same statements, and the same unresolved questions. And that suggested the larger story was only beginning to unfold in earnest. Could those forgotten records be pointing to something far bigger than anyone realized? Why are timelines suddenly being re-examined? And if the documents were always public, why is the pressure mounting now? Let's unravel the details. The narrative cracks. The conversation surrounding Meghan was beginning to change. Earlier debates had focused heavily on royal titles, public disagreements, and the ongoing tensions between the Sussexes and the monarchy. But as more people revisited older interviews, speeches, and media profiles, a different question started emerging. The issue was no longer simply about status or royal protocol. Increasingly, it became a debate about credibility. Critics were asking whether some of the stories that helped shape Meghan's public image had been presented accurately, while supporters argued that her words were being unfairly dissected years after the fact. Either way, attention was shifting toward the foundation of the narrative itself. One story repeatedly found its way back into the spotlight. For years, Meghan had spoken publicly about an experience from her childhood involving a Procter & Gamble advertisement. According to the story, she was disturbed by a commercial that appeared to reinforce gender stereotypes. She described writing letters to influential figures and helping inspire a change in the advertisement. The account became a defining part of her public identity. It was shared during speeches, humanitarian events, interviews, and international appearances. More than just a childhood memory, it became an example of early activism and personal determination, helping establish the image of someone willing to challenge powerful institutions from a young age. Then renewed scrutiny brought fresh questions. Journalists and fact-checkers revisited the story and attempted to verify specific details. Reports indicated that some elements could not be independently confirmed. Questions emerged regarding whether key parts of the narrative had been remembered differently over time, or whether the story had become simplified through repeated retelling. Critics seized on those findings, arguing that an important piece of Meghan's public biography was no longer as clear-cut as it once appeared. Supporters countered that the broader point remained unchanged, regardless of whether every detail could be verified decades later. The disagreement only fueled further discussion. The controversy deepened when comments from Thomas Markle entered the conversation. Speaking publicly, he suggested that aspects of the story may have been embellished over the years. His remarks immediately attracted attention because they came from someone closely connected to Meghan's early life. For critics, his comments seemed significant. For supporters, they represented another instance of a complicated family relationship being used to challenge her reputation. Yet regardless of perspective, the effect was undeniable. A story that had once been widely accepted was now being examined from multiple angles. As more interviews and public statements were revisited, the discussion expanded beyond a single childhood anecdote. Observers began comparing earlier claims with later explanations, looking for consistency and context. Some believed the scrutiny revealed meaningful contradictions. Others argued that ordinary changes in wording were being transformed into controversy. What made the situation notable was not universal agreement, but the growing willingness to question previously accepted narratives. By this stage, the debate had moved far beyond titles and royal disputes. It was becoming a larger examination of trust, authenticity, and public perception. And as those questions continued to spread, they pointed toward a far deeper challenge that was only beginning to take shape. But as reporters dig deeper, an even bigger mystery begins to emerge. Were these inconsistencies innocent mistakes, carefully crafted omissions, or something far more deliberate? And if one celebrated story starts falling apart, how many others could be next? Keep watching. Silence became his strongest weapon. As the controversy surrounding Meghan continued to grow, many people expected Prince William to respond directly. Public disagreements within the royal family had generated headlines for years, and there was no shortage of opportunities for him to challenge accusations, defend the monarchy, or publicly counter claims made by the Sussexes. Yet something unexpected happened. William largely remained silent. There were no dramatic interviews, no public attacks, and no visible attempts to engage in an ongoing war of words. While others debated, analyzed, and argued, he appeared content to stay in the background. That decision would eventually become a story of its own. At first, some observers interpreted the silence as caution. The royal family has long operated under an unofficial philosophy of avoiding public confrontation whenever possible. For decades, senior royals often responded to controversy with restraint rather than immediate reaction. William seemed to follow that tradition. However, as months turned into years, his refusal to engage began attracting increasing attention. The absence of a response was no longer being viewed as simple caution. Instead, many commentators started asking whether it was part of a much larger strategy. The more public scrutiny Meghan faced, the more noticeable William's silence became. New discussions emerged around old agreements, past interviews, and previously documented events. Reporters, commentators, and online audiences revisited records that had been available for years. Yet throughout those conversations, William rarely entered the debate himself. He did not need to explain every detail or challenge every claim. The documents, statements, and archived records were already being examined by others. In the eyes of some royal watchers, that changed the entire dynamic. Gradually, public attention shifted away from competing narratives and toward behavior. People began comparing actions rather than statements. Meghan continued to face questions about various aspects of her public story, while William remained largely focused on official duties and royal responsibilities. Whether fair or unfair, that contrast became increasingly difficult to ignore. Supporters of Meghan argued that silence should not be mistaken for proof of anything. Critics argued that William's restraint made the scrutiny surrounding Meghan appear more significant. Both sides reached different conclusions, but the comparison itself became unavoidable. What made the situation particularly unusual was that William's lack of public involvement seemed to amplify interest rather than reduce it. Every time new questions emerged, people noticed who was speaking and who was not. Every fresh controversy highlighted the same contrast. Meghan found herself at the center of debates, while William remained largely absent from them. That absence created space for others to interpret events on their own, often without direct intervention from the palace. Some observers believed this approach reflected confidence. Others saw it as a calculated decision to let time and public records shape perceptions naturally. There was no clear consensus, yet the effect was undeniable. The conversation was evolving, and William's silence had become part of the narrative itself. Far from disappearing into the background, it was increasingly viewed as a powerful force influencing how the wider story was being understood. And as scrutiny continued to build, that silent strategy appeared to be setting the stage for even greater questions ahead. Yet the deeper William retreated, the louder the questions became. Was his silence hiding a calculated advantage? Had someone underestimated the power of saying nothing? And as attention quietly shifted, which unexpected development was about to place the entire narrative under a harsher spotlight? Let's find out. When the money started talking. As questions about Meghan's public image continued spreading, attention began moving into an area that was far harder to dismiss. The discussion was no longer focused solely on interviews, personal stories, or royal disagreements. Increasingly, people started examining the commercial side of the Sussex brand. For years, Meghan and Harry had been viewed as one of the most marketable couples in the world. Their departure from royal duties generated enormous interest, and major companies rushed to build partnerships with them. At the time, the opportunities seemed limitless. Powerful brands, global media platforms, and influential publishers all appeared eager to invest in the future they were creating. In 2020, the Sussexes entered a reported deal with Netflix that immediately attracted worldwide attention. The agreement represented far more than a typical entertainment contract. It reflected confidence in their ability to draw audiences through their unique connection to the royal family. Around the same period, Spotify entered a major podcast partnership with the couple, while publishing opportunities expanded as public fascination with their story remained strong. These deals helped establish the perception that Meghan and Harry were successfully transforming royal visibility into long-term commercial success. For a while, that perception appeared justified. The Sussex name remained a global talking point, and their projects generated significant media coverage. Yet as time passed, signs of change began emerging. Some partnerships failed to develop as originally expected. Others ended altogether. What once looked like unstoppable momentum started raising uncomfortable questions. Industry observers began comparing initial expectations with actual results. The gap between the two became increasingly difficult to ignore. The situation drew even more attention when major relationships reportedly came to an end. Spotify concluded its partnership after producing far less content than many had anticipated. Netflix eventually moved away from its production arrangement with Archewell. Reports also suggested that publishing relationships were no longer continuing under the same terms. None of these developments automatically proved failure, but together they created a pattern that many commentators found difficult to overlook. The timing fueled speculation that something larger might be happening behind the scenes. What made the discussion particularly significant was the difference between public perception and industry perception. Public audiences often viewed the Sussexes through the lens of celebrity, controversy, and media attention. Companies, however, tend to evaluate partnerships through performance, audience engagement, and commercial return. Those are very different measurements. A person can remain famous while still facing challenges in the business world. As more partnerships shifted or expired, some observers wondered whether the commercial value of the Sussex brand was beginning to change. Questions naturally followed. Were these simply normal business decisions that happen throughout the entertainment industry? Or were companies quietly reassessing expectations they once believed would be met? Different analysts offered different answers. Supporters argued that high-profile contracts frequently evolve and that media narratives often exaggerate setbacks. Critics interpreted the same developments as evidence of deeper concerns regarding credibility and brand strength. Whatever the explanation, the conversation was no longer confined to reputation alone. Financial relationships were now becoming part of the story. And when major companies, investors, and business partners start re-evaluating expectations, the consequences can extend far beyond public opinion. That shift suggested the stakes were growing larger, and the next phase of the unfolding narrative could prove even more consequential. But were these deals simply reaching their natural end? Or was something happening behind closed doors? Why were key partners growing cautious? And if reputation was driving every decision, what shocking development was about to make the financial concerns look minor compared to what came next? Stay with us. Voices from her inner circle. As scrutiny surrounding Meghan continued to expand, the focus shifted once again. This time, the discussion was not driven by royal commentators, media headlines, or business partnerships. Instead, attention turned toward people who had once occupied a much closer position in her life. Former staff members, longtime friends, trusted associates, and individuals who had worked alongside her began attracting renewed interest. On their own, each account might have seemed insignificant. Together, however, they created a pattern that many observers found difficult to ignore. The conversation was no longer coming from a single source. It was emerging from multiple directions at the same time. One of the most frequently discussed topics involved staff turnover. Reports over several years documented a significant number of departures connected to Meghan and Harry's operation. Critics pointed to the number itself, arguing that such a pattern naturally invited questions. Supporters responded that high-pressure environments often experience staffing changes, particularly when public scrutiny is intense and expectations remain exceptionally high. Yet regardless of interpretation, the departures continued attracting attention because they became part of a much larger narrative that was already unfolding. The issue gained additional weight when certain former staff members became public subjects of discussion. Samantha Cohen, a highly experienced royal aide who had worked within the institution for many years, was often mentioned in those conversations. Her role placed her in a unique position during Meghan's transition into royal life. Reports surrounding staffing challenges and the difficulties involved in finding long-term replacements became widely discussed among royal observers. While many details remained private, the situation contributed to growing questions about what was happening behind the scenes. Attention also extended beyond professional relationships. Former friends and personal associates began resurfacing in media discussions, bringing new layers to an already complicated story. Some of these individuals had shared decades of history with Meghan. Others had played important roles during key periods of her public life. Over time, several described relationships that ended abruptly or faded without explanation. Their accounts differed in details, but critics argued that certain themes appeared repeatedly. Supporters countered that friendships end for countless reasons and that personal relationships are often far more complicated than public narratives suggest. What made these stories particularly powerful was not any single allegation. It was the repetition of similar observations from people connected to different chapters of Meghan's life. Some described feeling unexpectedly cut off. Others spoke about dramatic shifts in relationships after years of closeness. None of these accounts provided definitive proof of anything, but they contributed to a growing perception that certain patterns deserved closer examination. As more stories resurfaced, public curiosity only intensified. The renewed focus on former allies created a difficult situation because it moved the discussion into deeply personal territory. Business contracts could be measured. Public statements could be verified. Relationships were far less straightforward. Different people could experience the same events in completely different ways. That reality made every account open to interpretation. Still, the cumulative effect was impossible to dismiss. The criticism surrounding Meghan was no longer coming solely from commentators or opponents. Increasingly, it included voices from people who had once been part of her world. And as those voices continued entering the conversation, they added another layer of uncertainty to a story that seemed to grow more complex with every passing chapter. Why do so many voices from different corners keep repeating the same troubling patterns? What did insiders witness that still refuses to disappear? And as more pieces suddenly align, is an even bigger revelation waiting just beyond the surface? Stay glued. The Crown plays long games. By this stage of the story, the focus was no longer centered entirely on Meghan, Prince Harry, or even Prince William. Something much larger was beginning to emerge. The spotlight was shifting toward the monarchy itself. For years, public discussion had often framed events as a personal dispute between individuals. Supporters and critics debated personalities, interviews, and competing narratives. Yet beneath those headlines stood an institution that had survived political upheaval, family crises, scandals, abdications, and generations of change. Unlike individuals, institutions rarely react quickly. Their strength often comes from patience, and that reality was becoming increasingly important. As scrutiny surrounding Meghan continued to intensify, many observers noticed a striking contrast. Public controversies moved at a rapid pace. Headlines appeared and disappeared within days. Social media debates erupted and faded almost overnight. The monarchy operated on an entirely different timeline. While commentators argued about immediate events, the institution continued functioning according to traditions and structures developed over centuries. That difference created an important distinction. Individuals often seek immediate victories. Institutions tend to focus on long-term stability. Prince William's role within that larger framework became a growing topic of discussion. Throughout much of the controversy, he avoided direct public confrontation. Critics of Meghan sometimes interpreted that restraint as strategic, Supporters viewed it as evidence that claims of an organized campaign against her lacked substance. Regardless of perspective, one reality remained unchanged. William's position was steadily evolving. As heir to the throne, he represented not only himself, but also the future direction of the monarchy. That fact naturally encouraged speculation about what his eventual reign might mean. Questions about the future became increasingly difficult to separate from present events. Some royal commentators pointed to reports suggesting that William held strong views regarding ongoing disputes involving the Sussexes. Others argued that much of the speculation exceeded the available evidence. Yet the debate persisted because the institution itself possesses powers and responsibilities that extend beyond personal disagreements. When discussions turned toward titles, royal privileges, and future constitutional decisions, the conversation moved into territory far larger than family conflict. Historical precedent added another layer of intrigue. The British monarchy has repeatedly demonstrated its ability to outlast crises that once appeared overwhelming. Over generations, public figures have come and gone while the institution remained. That history shaped how many observers interpreted current events. Some believed patience was becoming the monarchy's greatest advantage. Rather than responding to every controversy, the institution appeared content to allow time, process, and establish structures to play their role. This perspective fueled growing speculation. Was the monarchy deliberately avoiding confrontation because it understood that immediate responses often create new problems? Or was its silence simply consistent with long-standing tradition? Different answers emerged depending on who was asked, yet both viewpoints acknowledged the same underlying reality. The institution operated according to rules that extended far beyond any single headline. As attention increasingly shifted toward William's eventual future as king, the stakes appeared to change. The story was no longer being viewed solely as Meghan versus William. Instead, it was beginning to resemble something much larger, an ongoing collision between personal narratives and institutional authority. And if that interpretation proved correct, the most significant chapter of the conflict might still be waiting beyond the horizon ahead. If the institution has finally entered the battle, how far is it willing to go? Which unseen forces are already moving behind closed doors? And when William's moment arrives, will decades of patience reveal a plan far bigger than anyone imagined waiting in silence all along? The battle for public trust. By the time the controversy reached this stage, the discussion had evolved into something far more significant than royal disagreements, business setbacks, or disputed stories from the past. All of those issues still mattered, but they now pointed toward a larger question that seemed impossible to avoid. The real battle was no longer over specific events. It was over credibility itself. As commentators, journalists, and members of the public revisited years of interviews, statements, and public appearances, attention increasingly focused on one issue above all others: whom people believed. For Meghan, this represented a particularly difficult challenge. Public figures can survive criticism. They can recover from negative headlines. They can even overcome failed projects or strained relationships. Trust, however, operates differently. Once questions begin forming around credibility, every new development tends to be viewed through that same lens. This was the atmosphere that appeared to be taking shape. Each resurfaced interview, each disputed account, and each public disagreement became part of a broader conversation about consistency and authenticity. What made the situation even more complicated was that there was no universal agreement about what the evidence actually showed. Supporters continued arguing that Meghan was facing extraordinary levels of scrutiny compared to other public figures. They believed many criticisms ignored context, oversimplified events, or relied on selective interpretations. Critics viewed the situation differently. They argued that recurring questions surrounding interviews, personal stories, business partnerships, and former associates revealed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The divide between those perspectives continued widening. At the same time, media narratives became part of the controversy themselves. Different outlets often presented the same events in dramatically different ways. One report might frame a development as a misunderstanding, while another described it as a significant contradiction. As audiences encountered competing versions of the same story, many found themselves uncertain about what to believe. That uncertainty became increasingly important because public perception often shapes reality in ways that facts alone cannot. The Sussex brand now appeared to be standing at a critical crossroads. For years, its strength had been built on a powerful combination of global visibility, personal storytelling, and public engagement. Yet brands are ultimately based on audience confidence. They depend on people believing in the message being presented. As doubts continued spreading, some observers wondered whether the brand could maintain the same influence it once enjoyed. Others believed the scrutiny would eventually fade and that public interest would move elsewhere, as it often does. Meanwhile, Prince William remained largely absent from the public argument. That absence continued fueling speculation among royal watchers who believed his strategy of restraint had allowed events to unfold without direct intervention. Whether that interpretation was accurate remained open to debate, but the perception itself became part of the story. In the end, the greatest threat no longer appeared to be criticism from opponents or pressure from the monarchy. It was the possibility that growing numbers of people might begin questioning the narrative they had once accepted. If that happened, the consequences could extend far beyond headlines, and that possibility left the future of the entire story hanging in uncertainty. So, what do you think? Do you believe William actually exposed Meghan, or is this just media speculation going too far? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more updates.